A recent study has found that women who carry a little extra weight live longer than the men who mention it. Today is August 12th, the feast day of St. Jane Frances de Chantal, remarkable woman who had many different walks of life, first beginning as a wife and mother, and then as a widow, and then as a nun, and as a foundress of a religious community. St. Jane was born in the Burgundy region of France in 1572 into a wealthy family, one of nobility. Her father was the president of the Parliament of Burgundy. She had many joys in her life, but also you'll see many crosses, many sufferings. Her mother died when Jane was only 18 months old, so she never got to know her mother. Her father was a good man who made sure she had the finest education. She was raised with the best schooling, and she was intelligent and beautiful and very refined. As a confirmation student, she took the name Frances, so she became known as Jane Frances. Her father arranged a marriage for her when she was 21 years of age. She was married to Christopher, who was the Baron de Chantal, very noble, wealthy young man. They lived in Dijon, France. Of course, we know Dijon from the famous mustard. That's the same region where the mustard comes from. They had a fairy tale wedding. They lived in a castle. St. Jane was very devout. She had a priest say daily mass for them in the castle. They were blessed with 6 children during their short marriage of 9 years. Sadly, 3 of them died in infancy, which was not uncommon in those days with the mortality rate. They had, again, 9 years of marriage. Again, it was a very good, happy marriage. But then her husband was out on a hunting expedition with his cousin, and unfortunately his cousin accidentally shot Christopher in the leg. And it was an accident, but Christopher died 9 days later of infection. He died being nursed by Jane. He died with the sacraments and died a holy death. So here she was now a widow at the young age of 28. She even had a 2-week-old baby she had just given birth to. She fell into a deep depression, 4 months of deep despair and depression. But thanks be to God, a Bishop Francis de Sales came to town. He was the Bishop of Geneva. He came to her town to preach a Lenten mission, and she attended it. He spoke about the love of God and the importance of forgiveness in our lives. And there she willingly forgave her cousin for the accident, and eventually even became the godmother of one of his children. But she, of course, was still a widow with 4 young children. Her father-in-law forced her to move to his castle. He was a tyrant, and for 7 years she had to live under his tyrannical authority, and also a very difficult housekeeper that he had. But she prayed every night with her children that God would help them and deliver them. Fortunately, because she had met Francis de Sales, they corresponded with each other, and he began writing letters to her. He became her spiritual director, and she thrived under his direction and taking care of her children, and he helped her overcome her depression by getting her to visit the poor and the sick and to take care of the victims of the pandemic, the plague of those days. And because she then wasn't thinking about herself, she was loving and serving others, she began to grow in virtue and holiness. Her hardness was changed to sweetness and mildness, and her strong will was softened. She again began to feel called to the religious life, and under the guidance of St. Francis de Sales, they decided to form a brand new religious order in the church called the Visitation Sisters. Now, most of the orders in those days would only accept young women, and yet there were many widows and older women or women with weak constitutions, had poor health, that also wanted to become nuns, but there was no order for them in the church. So they together founded the Order of the Visitation, which would take widows and older women and women who could not really survive the the rigors of some of these other religious communities. So they founded the Visitation Order, and they based themselves upon the virtues of our Blessed Mother when she visited St. Elizabeth, which were charity, Our Lady's love for her cousin Elizabeth, Mary's humility, even though she was the Mother of God, she went to visit and take care of her cousin, meekness and service. Those are the qualities of the Visitation Sisters. It was a unique order because they lived in community, but then they went out to take care of the poor and the needy. They had an active apostolate, which was unheard of in those days. And it was really too new for the church because eventually their rule was modified where they then had to live completely in cloister, which as they are today, about 150 monasteries of visitation nuns around the world today, and they live the contemplative cloistered life. It was the writings of St. Francis de Sales to St. Jane and to his sisters that eventually became his treatise on the love of God and the Introduction to the Devout Life, two of his greatest books. St. Jane was personal friends with St. Vincent de Paul, who once said of her that I regard her as the holiest soul I have ever met on this earth. But then more crosses came into her life. St. Francis de Sales died in the year 1622. That was devastating for Jane. Now she herself was in charge of the order by herself without the support of Bishop de Sales. Then 5 years later, her 31-year-old son was killed in battle. The plague continued to rage in France, and she went through a spiritual darkness, the dark night of the soul, for many years. It's what Mother Teresa went through, this dark night of the soul. And yet she persevered, and she died at the age of 69, having spent really the last 30 years of her life traveling all over France and Europe, establishing convents of Visitation Sisters. By her death, there were 86 communities, 86 monasteries and convents of Visitation nuns. She was like Teresa of Avila, who went all over Spain, and St. Jane went all over France. She was canonized in 1767. So we see a really unique person, a wife, a mother, a widow, a nun, and a religious foundress of an order. And notice the relationship between St. Francis de Sales and St. Jane. You'll see this often, these dynamic duos that God raises up in the church, like St. Francis and St. Clare in the 13th century, or St. Benedict and Scholastica, or St. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. So here we have in that 16th century and early part of the 17th century, the great duo of Francis de Sales and St. Jane Francis de Chantal. St. Jane is the patron saint of those who have experienced the death of their parents or the death of children. She's a patron saint of widows and also the patron saint of those who have difficult in-laws. I'm sure none of you have that, right? None of you have difficult in-laws. But if you do, St. Jane is your patron saint. I'll give you a blessing now with the relic of her spiritual director, St. Francis de Sales. Through the intercession of St. Francis de Sales and St. Jane, may Almighty God bless you, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.